The California congressional delegation is a force to be reckoned with in Congress. Because California has more people than any other state, it has more members of Congress than any other state. And one of them is the most powerful member of Congress, the Speaker of the House. But two of the newer members of the delegation have each become a force to be reckoned with in their first terms in office. The junior senator from California, just in her third year in the Senate, is now one of the leading Democratic presidential candidates. Senator Kamala Harris is now polling well ahead of President Trump in a Quinnipiac national poll, beating Donald Trump by 8 points. Senator Harris will be our first guest tonight, responding to some of what the president had to say in President Trump's official campaign announcement tonight in Florida. Also with us tonight, later in the hour, is California's newest congressional star, Democratic Congresswoman Katie Porter, who is now in her first year in the House of Representatives, serving in a congressional district that has voted Republican for 50 years, until Katie Porter came along to change their minds and convince them to vote for a Democrat. Congresswoman Katie Porter has just announced that she is now in favor of beginning the impeachment process against President Trump. Congresswoman Porter will join us to explain her decision tonight. Tonight, President Trump officially announced that he is running for re-election. No surprise there. To make that announcement, the president flew to Orlando, Florida, where he was greeted by an extraordinary editorial in the Orlando Sentinel today. A year and a half before the election, the Orlando Sentinel delivered an endorsement for president in 2020, and that endorsement is not Donald Trump. The editorial said Donald Trump is in Orlando to announce the kickoff of his re-election campaign. We're here to announce our endorsement for president in 2020, or at least we're not endorsing Donald Trump. The Orlando Sentinel historically is a Republican newspaper. It has occasionally endorsed Democrats for president, including Barack Obama in 2008. But then the Orlando Sentinel endorsed President Obama's Republican opponent, Mitt Romney, in the next election. The Orlando Sentinel's editorial about Donald Trump says Trump's successful assault on truth is the great casualty of this presidency, followed closely by his war on decency. President Trump is campaigning in a state tonight, in Florida, where the latest poll shows him losing to our first guest and 5 other Democratic presidential candidates. Donald Trump won Florida's 29 electoral votes by 1.3% of the vote. He cannot afford to lose any support in Florida. And national polls also show President Trump losing to our first guest tonight, as well as 5 other Democratic candidates for president. President Trump is beginning his re-election campaign with threats. One threat seems to be to Iran. The president has ordered 1,000 troops to the Middle East in response to what the Trump administration calls, quote, Iranian attacks. Congressman Seth Moulton, the Democratic presidential candidate with the most military experience, including 4 tours of duty in combat in Iraq, said this in response to the president sending 1,000 troops to the Middle East. We can't afford to send troops to the Middle East without a strategy. We've already learned that the hard way. President Trump's other big threat at the official launch of his re-election campaign is a return to his first presidential campaign's first principle: attacking people who try to cross our southern border. Last night, Donald Trump tweeted, next week, ICE will begin the process of removing millions of illegal aliens who have illicitly found their way into the United States. Joining us now to respond to the president's first night on the re-election campaign trail is a Democratic presidential candidate who is leading President Trump in the latest Florida poll, and in a national Quinnipiac poll, leading President Trump by 8 points, 49% to 41%. She is the Democratic presidential candidate who represents more people than any other Democratic candidate currently represents, the 40 million people of California. Senator Kamala Harris, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Great to be with you.
I want to start with your reaction to the president saying he wants to round up millions of people in this country and deport them.
It's outrageous. And, you know, the way that I come at this issue, Lawrence, is, you know, I was a career prosecutor, and I will tell you that when you have the President of the United States saying things like this, it is just pushing people into the shadows. And the real result of these words will be that there will be some woman who is afraid to hail down a patrol car after she's been raped for fear that she'll be deported. The real effect of the words of the President of the United States, whether it's followed through or not, will be that there will be children who are going to refuse to go to school tomorrow because they're going to be afraid that if they come home, their parent won't be there. Children who will not go to the doctor's office because they do not want to be separated or concerned that they can't trust somebody in a position of authority because their parent may be deported. It's outrageous, and it is just yet another example of this president's incompetence when it comes to understanding we are a nation of immigrants, understanding that we need to pass comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway towards citizenship, understanding that the values and the morals of who we are as a country are not that we separate children from their parents at the border and put children in cages, but that we act with a sense of practicality. This president doesn't understand, I don't think, the importance and the significance of his job, which is the job of president should be to lift people up, not to keep beating people down. But that's the only thing he knows how to do, is beat people down. And it is not the sign of a strong person to do that. I believe that's a sign of weakness.
You represent the biggest state on our southern border, California. You are the daughter of two immigrants. Which of those things informs your position on this the most? Your family history or your geographic location representing California?
What informs my position on this subject the most is that I am an American. And I believe in the values of who we say we are. And I'm also a student of history. And I know that we are a nation of immigrants. Unless you're a Native American or your ancestors were kidnapped and brought over on a slave ship, your people are immigrants. And it is immigrants that help build the country into what it is today. And the idea that we would have a president of the United States that vilifies immigrants, that wants to build what I call his vanity project, a multi-billion-dollar wall, which, by the way, will never get built, is un-American. Deal with the problem. We have 11 million people here who need a pathway to citizenship. Be a leader on that. But we're not going to get that out of this president. What we're not going to get out of this president is someone who approaches people who are fleeing the murder capitals of the world and does what is reflective of American values, which is to understand the strength of our arms, to embrace people who are fleeing harm. No, that's not what this president does. They arrive at our border and he says, go back to where you came from. That is not reflective of the values of who we are as Americans, and that's what informs my perspective on what he is doing on this issue and so many others.
Did you get to see the president's speech tonight?
No.
Okay. You've seen something like it because the person who he mentioned the most, he didn't mention you at all. He mentioned Joe Biden once. He mentioned Hillary Clinton more than any other person that he mentioned in that campaign speech tonight as an opponent, as if it were 4 years ago. And I just wanted to let you hear one moment of the crowd reacting to him talking about Hillary Clinton. Let's listen to that.
Remember the insurance policy just in case Hillary Clinton lost. Remember the insurance policy.
So it's still a lock her up rally.
Yeah, but that's further another example of the fact that this president wants us to keep looking in the rearview mirror instead of looking out of the front windshield. This is a president who wants to make America great again instead of making America great today. He does not understand that we need a leader of our United States who is focused on the challenges of the 21st century. And he keeps looking backward, and trying to take people backward. What we need is a president who takes us forward, who has a vision for the future that includes everyone. And we're not going to get that in this guy. And so, you know, great, he started his election. Some of us have been in the campaign for a while now and look forward to meeting him on the debate stage.
The crisis of the week, which has been building and building and building during the Trump administration, especially during the time of John Bolton, is now the crisis with Iran. With the president, the White House is saying there's absolutely no question that Iran is guilty of the attacks on those tankers that we saw in the Straits of Hormuz. What would you be saying to Iran today if you were president of the United States?
Well, first, I would not have pulled us out of the Iran nuclear deal. They were complying with the requirements. If there's no oversight, we can't guarantee that they won't build a nuclear weapon. And we had the power and the ability to have oversight and to make sure that they were complying by the rules, which they were. And he, in a unilateral action, pulled out, which was not only not smart, because so far it was working, but it was also unilateral action, not bringing along and apparently not consulting our allies around the globe who are also invested in the right outcome. So let's start with that. Wouldn't have done that. And now we can look at a situation where we are potentially being exposed to, some would say war. And again, another example of the irresponsibility of this president who does not appreciate his power. He does not respect it. It is about his ego, and it is not about what is in the best interest of our nation and, frankly, our national security. You
serve on the Intelligence Committee. Have you been briefed on the attacks on these tankers?
I have.
Are you convinced that Iran is guilty of these attacks?
I can't talk about that.
Do you believe that the public is now in a position where we can trust what the administration says about this?
I am of the opinion and belief that there is a lot of what this administration says about policy, domestic and foreign, that is misleading the public.
What about Iran? What about right now in the middle of this?
Listen, I mean, Lawrence, let's be clear. Iran presents a threat to the United States, which is why we engaged and entered into the nuclear agreement in the first place. So let's be clear about that. And so the question then becomes, knowing the danger and the potential threat presented, what do we do to keep our nation safe? And a lot of thought and negotiations went into what seemed to be a feasible solution, which was the deal, where we would have the ability to track and to have accountability. And now he's pulled us out of that.
If you were president, would you have the United States rejoin that deal?
I would certainly have us rejoin it. I would also look toward expanding it, to be honest with you. I would like to see it cover also ballistic missile testing. I'd like to, see it that we would have certainly accountability, but probably increased oversight. But sure, yes.
If you're in a negotiation like that as president with Iran or another country, but particularly with Iran in a situation like that where you're saying we want to reinstate the deal that we had before, and Iran says to you, why should we do that? How can we trust you? That it will only last for the length of your presidency. That's what we've learned about the United States.
I mean, look, at some point, they're going to have to join in an understanding that this is about the United States. It's about our allies around the world, including the EU. And, there's going to have to be a moment in time when we have a new president, and I intend that to be myself. Establish relationships with probably everyone around the globe. Because to your point, this president has put us in a position where our neighbors around the world, be they friend or foe, are believing they cannot trust the word of the American president. And that's a dangerous place to be in.
The president tonight talked about factories being reopened now, and that no factories had opened for decades. And he rattled off a list of states that include, for example, the largest BMW plant in the world in South Carolina, that apparently he thinks is something that just occurred somewhere during his presidency. What would you say to voters, and particularly in a debate with Donald Trump, about this industrial policy of his, about his attempts to create what economists call an industrial policy to favor certain industries?
Well, ask the workers in Lordstown, Ohio. Ask the almost 700,000 auto workers in our country who are probably going to lose their jobs by Christmas because of this president's supposed trade policy, which I call the Trump trade tax, which again was about his unilateral action that has resulted in farmers in Iowa having soybeans that are rotting in bins. These farmers who, over the last decade at least, cultivated a relationship in a market in China to sell it to, and now that's been cut off for them as a market. Talk to the millions of American families that are now paying $1.4 billion a month more for everything from a washing machine to shampoo. And look at the fact that these policies have not been smart, and they have not been in the best interest of American workers and the American economy and American families.
There's a recent analysis of the new manufacturing jobs that have been created during the Trump presidency. More of them have been created in the state of California than any other state. Most of these jobs have been created in places other than the places where President Trump promised them in the former heavy manufacturing states, Michigan. That's not where they're happening. They're happening in other more prosperous states. What's the lesson in that?
That the President of the United States misled a lot of people and failed them, because he said he was going to create jobs in those places. He said he was going to protect the workers in those places. He said he was going to support them. He said he was going to lift them up. Instead, he passed a tax bill that benefited the top 1% and the biggest corporations in this country. Instead, he has deregulated entire industries. Instead, he has created a distraction about, a wall, instead of lifting American workers up and preparing us for the jobs of the 21st century, instead of focusing on infrastructure, which is decaying in our country, which is 125 to 150 years old. And when we work on it, it'll not only be about saving the American families the cost of buying new tires because they're driving over potholes. It'll be about creating jobs, because the people who are going to work up and build back up our infrastructure are hardworking people with great skills and can fill those jobs for generations.
There's another aspect of this that most politicians never talk about, and certainly this president never talks about. They talk about international competition on jobs and on manufacturing locations. But there has always been a 50-state competition, states competing against other states. And California, your state, has always been a winner in that competition, usually the biggest winner. What is it that the California economy knows that some of the other states apparently don't know?
I think each state has its strengths, but I'll speak to California's strengths, which would be a priority for me for our nation. Part of California's strength is that we have invested in our educational systems. Over the years, we've done a great job and then not such a great job. But if you look at the impact of at least early investments in education, it's paid huge dividends. I believe we need to have national policy that's about investing in education. And by the way, I mean education after high school. And by that, I don't mean only college. I mean education for people after high school, and that could be a college track. That could be a track that is about skills development to get the certificate for the jobs that need to be filled. But that's what has been done in the past, which has shown great prosperity for American workers in California, and that's what we need to do nationally, and that's what I'm committed to doing. And again, that's about looking forward instead of looking backward.
Senator Kamala Harris, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you,
leading
Lawrence.
President Trump in national polls, how does that feel?
Listen, the only poll that matters to me is on Election Day. Period.
That is true. Senator, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Lauren.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.